Oh, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Angie. I'm one of the founders and creators of FODZYME. We make enzymes specifically targeting FODMAPs. And I'm joined today by our friends at FodShop, your one-stop low FODMAP online shop serving Australia, New Zealand, and now Asia Pacific. We'll get started in just a minute to talk about how to navigate restaurants, menus, other dining events with FODMAP sensitivities, or while you're actively in the elimination phase of the low FODMAP diet. And we'll also talk about ways to diversify and widen your options and access the full menu. We'll also have a sweet giveaway toward the end full of FODZYME goodies, so make sure to stick around for that. All right, should we just wait a few more seconds to let some folks trickle in, and then we'll get started. We'll go through a quick round of intros and then deep dive into the content. So I'll get started. My name is Angie again. I'm one of the creators of FODZYME, and I'm in the same boat as many of you, being FODMAP sensitive myself. I was diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, about 8 years ago and discovered my wonderful trigger foods through the low FODMAP diet. And our topic today is one that I've had a lot of experience with. And it's precisely from those experiences that led to the idea for FODZYME. So I developed FODZYME with a group of scientists because I wanted to be able to eat from the full menu again. But more on that in a little bit. I'll hand it over to Shani and Lisa to introduce themselves.
Thank you very much, Angie. It's a wonderful, wonderfully innovative background that you've got. As you guys know, my name is Shani. I started up FODShop in 2018 when I realised that there were so many people, in Australia, New Zealand, overseas, wherever, that have got these food intolerances, finding it sort of difficult to access safe, low FODMAP foods. So I was really inspired to help them, coming from a clinical nutrition and dietetics background, and put my knowledge to work and found and sourced hundreds of products and made them accessible in a one-stop shop. It's extremely humbling work that I get to do every day with a fantastic team, and we're very, very humbled and privileged to be able to work with FODZYME and make FODZYME available at FODShop to so many who have long been without such a great product.
Great. My name's Lisa. I am a nutritionist at FODShop, and I work alongside Shani. I have now for about over a year. So basically my role is to also work on the marketing at FODShop, and I organize things like this webinar today that we've got with FODZYME. So I'm really excited to do that. I myself also have IBS. I was diagnosed with fructose intolerance when I was 18 years old. So I've had the symptoms, I know what it's like, and it's really rewarding to be able to help other people that are going through the same thing.
Awesome. All right, so we have a packed agenda for today. We'll go over a really quick overview of the low FODMAP diet, discuss the challenges of combining dining out with that diet, and then we'll deep dive into tricks and tips for navigating that those conundrums, and further discuss how enzymes, specifically FODZYME, can help. We'll give some pro tips on using FODZYME, and last but not least, we have our giveaway. So again, make sure to stick to the end. Lisa, do you want to take over this?
Yeah, sure. So basically, I'm going to quickly explain FODMAPs for those of you who haven't heard of it. So FODMAP is an acronym. It stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. It's a lot of big words, but basically there's a lot of different foods that come under these categories. That can be your dairy products, fruits, vegetables, and also grain products. So the fermentable part of that stands for the process in which the gut bacteria ferment undigested FODMAPs, and that can pull water into the gut, and that can cause bloating as well. And when this happens, it affects how the muscles in your gut contract. So then people without IBS can really eat these high FODMAP foods without concern, but those with low with IBS, they can experience gastrointestinal discomfort, which is your symptoms like bloating, constipation, diarrhea, as well as pain in your stomach. So often people follow a low FODMAP diet, which is minimizing the amount of FODMAPs in your diet, and that is the best way at the moment to treat someone with IBS and manage your symptoms.
Awesome. Well, that's definitely all true, but sometimes having that low FODMAP diet, which is clinically very effective, can be practically on the social and gastronomical level difficult to maintain. And obviously, when you're restricting FODMAPs, that will leave us with a limited menu. And on top of that, it can be even a challenge to figure out what that limited menu within the full menu even is, because a lot of the ingredients might be hidden or unclear. And on top of that, something that I feel like doesn't get discussed frequently enough is really those psychological elements that make it multiple-fold more difficult. We can really feel like a burden to our companions and to restaurant staff to ask so many questions and make special requests. The social pressure and anxiety from my experience can be so strong that sometimes we feel even too self-conscious to ask, and we just want to get it over with, go with the flow. And I tell myself, we'll suffer the consequences later if need be, but just like, I don't want to make a scene right now. I've personally done that so many times, and I've heard the story from others as well. The stress can be so real. It just feels like you're trying to solve this puzzle while everyone's watching you, and the moments feel a lot longer than to you than to anyone else. So while we can, discuss kind of the technicalities of FODMAPs, I think that real lived experience at the restaurant scene is also something that really adds to the challenge, and it's real. And another thing that we didn't mention on the slides is really that sometimes, no matter how carefully you prepare and how clearly you communicate on your side, restaurants can still make mistakes. Or sometimes I've even had waiters tell me that when I've asked them, how often, like when you get people asking you to omit onions or garlic, what would you do? And they say, well, we'll say yes, and then we don't really care. So if you guys have ever had experiences like this where you've asked a server to omit an ingredient or make a switch, and they say yes, of course, but then the dish you receive is so clearly full of FODMAPs.
Yeah, I think there's this fear of being perceived as high maintenance, or being a burden. It's this extra step that the facility has to take. But I think personally, the food service cafes, restaurants all do need to adapt to the age that we're living in. 1 in 3 of us have a food intolerance or IBS or IBS type symptoms. So it's definitely something our industry needs to keep up with.
And it's going to be something easier the more of us speak up about it, and the more awareness there is about these intolerances.
100%.
All right, so how do we then overcome these challenges? Oh, forgot to mention that this was the hidden sources of FODMAPs that we were talking about. And Lisa, you might be able to elaborate on this with more detail.
Yeah, sure. So basically, in the first bit, we've got your onion and garlic, which I'm sure most of you would already know if you are somebody who's following a low FODMAP diet or you have IBS type symptoms. Basically, your onion and garlic comes into your fructans category. We've got your gluten-free breads. Those kind of things are in the GOS category. So that's galacto-oligosaccharides. We call it GOS for short, just to make it a little bit easier. We've even got some honey, those fructose-based syrups. That's all in your fructose and different veggies and fruits will also come under a mixture of those FODMAPs that I did talk about as well. Any of your dairy products, that's usually your lactose, which is also called a disaccharide. Those kinds of things all come under a FODMAP. So at the moment, the only thing that, for example, FODZYME doesn't cover is the polyols. So that is something that we ask people to watch out for, just because from my understanding, FODZYME's currently working on finding a cure to the polyols problem, because things like sorbitol and mannitol are currently not figured out on the market for a supplement that can help manage symptoms. But the good news is we do have all the other ones. So you do have your fructans, we do have the GOS, we do have the lactose, and that's a great way. So when you are out at a restaurant, it is great to take FODZYME along, because I myself have used it and I've found it really helpful, especially for things with onion and garlic in it. I know we were talking about some challenges before. A challenge for me has been when I go to an Italian restaurant and they say, oh, we've already made the sauce and it's got onion and garlic in it. So that's always difficult to make a new sauce, and it definitely feels like you're putting a burden on the restaurant. But just know you're not alone. These things are very common, so they do deal with it every day, even if they sometimes make it seem like they don't. And yeah, the more of our voices that are heard, the more that it will become acceptable, as Shani was saying as well.
Absolutely.
These and one thing I would also want to add on the topic of just like invisible ingredients in these hidden sources of FODMAPs is that it's also difficult to determine how much of, for instance, garlic or onion is in there just from tasting it, because the compounds that are responsible for taste are not the FODMAPs, and the way those things are processed could reduce some of that flavor, but still maintain all of that FODMAP content. So it's hard to say, oh, this tastes really garlicky, so it must be, it must be higher in fructan than this other dish that's less garlicky. So that does add to those challenges. All right,
Definitely. So yeah, I was just going to say the allium compounds, which are a different category of compounds altogether, give this beautiful flavor. But, alliums are a different category altogether from FODMAP. So there's foods are complex and there's lots of molecules in them. So definitely good to, to understand the differences there.
For sure. All right. So we have some tips for overcoming those challenges. Number one is to do your research. Choose restaurants carefully, study their menus, call ahead of time to understand the ingredients and if they can make accommodations. I know this sounds like a lot of work, but it can reduce so much stress during the meal so that you can fully enjoy the social and culinary dimensions fully. I've also seen some restaurants offer full ingredient lists as a menu, with allergen details, and I've even seen menus specifically indicating alliums like garlic and onion. And although that's rare, it's never hurts to ask. And if there's something that you really want that has a high FODMAP component, like a sauce, ask them if they can switch it out for something low FODMAP, or at least have that on the side so you can offer it to others in your party. And some restaurants, in my experience, have been really willing to accommodate, and they may be able to help you pick and choose parts of different dishes, especially sides and stuff, and to combine it into your own. Another tip I would add is to try to call in at a time when the restaurant is not so busy, so that communicating with the chef is easier and they have time to actually devote to you. I'd also recommend getting the names of the people you speak with and making sure that they put in a clear note for you if you are putting in a special request ahead of time. Anything you guys wanted to add to this one?
I think I would have mentioned all of those too, Angie. Yeah, definitely good to, view the menu before you go out, call ahead, communicate. All of those things are super important.
Yeah, and tip number 2 is to to not be afraid to communicate with servers. I know it's such a simple tip, you know, making special requests, even on the spot, having, for instance, a list of the foods you're sensitive to. And if you're traveling to a country where there's a foreign language is spoken, to have that translated. And it might also be helpful to explain your restrictions to the company you're joining with. And that if you're comfortable with them, because while you're speaking with the servers, that can add a little bit of that moral support. And again, this sounds like such a simple tip. And I think the hardest thing about it might just be those psychological barriers, the fear of appearing too demanding, drawing attention to yourself and your eating habits. But don't forget that the restaurant is offering you a service and an experience that you're in the end paying them for. And they're, after all, in the hospitality industry, so they should be hospitable to you. Otherwise, they can just be a vending machine or something. And I think as long as you're kind and courteous, you have every right to advocate for your dietary needs. Another thing I was thinking about while just reflecting on the what I mentioned about waiters sometimes, you know, just completely ignoring a request while affirming that they'll take your request. I realized that in my experience, I've often wanted to, you know, just make as little of a deal as possible and not discuss my condition. I just say, hey, can you make it without garlic and onions? And then they say yes. And that's really something, that's a request that can sound kind of arbitrary and out of context. But I find that when I share a little bit more about the why, it really conveys more importance and urgency. Like when you just tell a small slice of your story, you don't have to go into full-blown detail, but say something like, hey, I'm really sensitive to garlic. There's not an issue with fast content.
Yeah, that's a very important, I guess.
It makes you really more.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think it's a very important, like, psychosocial barrier that we have to overcome. You know, it requires a bit of more confidence, or you know, to be able to advocate. And I think, as Lisa and yourself were mentioning, Angie, the more that we can discuss and talk about this and have these conversations, the more socially acceptable or permissible it becomes to do it. So it becomes more familiar.
Yeah, for sure. And someone actually I saw in the chat earlier said, I can't believe there's so many people all over the world with the same gut experience as me. And yeah. I'll tell you that, you know, I'm sure Shani, Lisa, you guys have similar experiences, but because we talk to customers and users and folks with gut disorders, conditions all the time, and this is kind of always on our radar, there are more people than you think. Everybody, if they don't have, you know, really maybe a full-blown condition themselves, they'll know someone in their lives very close to them that do. All right, so moving on to tip number 3. Remember that FODMAPs are not a black and white framework, but a balancing act of quantities and timing. Of course, it's best to know your tolerance levels or trigger thresholds ahead of time so that you can plan accordingly for your meal. For instance, if you know that you can generally tolerate up to 1 slice of wheat bread and you're ordering a sandwich or burger, you might choose to enjoy it open-faced without the top bun or slice. But of course, this only works with the kind of larger, more visible ingredients, like let's say avocado or Brussels sprouts, for example, but not so much for those invisible ingredients like the garlic and onion and those ingredients that Lisa mentioned, the hidden sweeteners, especially as they can be difficult to approximate even by taste. And because it's also about timing and really that overall FODMAP burden in your system over a given short period of time as everything's transiting through your GI tract, remember to limit FODMAP intake in the meals leading up to, say, your dinner during the day, and also perhaps the next morning if that's typically your timing range for getting symptoms.
Yeah, definitely. Something I'll add on that with the FODMAP stacking is sometimes you don't realize as well that even if you're not having foods high in FODMAPs, you could be doing everything right, having those low FODMAP servings throughout the day. They can still stack, especially with fructose, which is something I struggle with, having those fruits. And if you have lots of them, even if you're having them in low FODMAP quantities, that does still count as stacking. So it is just kind of about finding your own tolerance, and it is a bit of a journey, but it is possible. And something I would also really recommend is watching your fiber intake. A lot of the time when you're on a low FODMAP diet, we omit foods that contain fiber, which is your fruit, veg, your grains. And it is really important to keep those foods up, because keeping your fiber intake up will help keep your bowels regular, and that will prevent symptoms like constipation and diarrhea as well, especially when you're going out to dinner and you might be eating foods that are high in FODMAP. Or maybe you're not sure if you do order something, if it is high in FODMAP or not. It might not even just be the onion and garlic. There could be other things in there that are hidden, like with those sauces, as Angie was saying. So yeah, always try and keep yourself as low FODMAP as possible throughout the day and watch that fiber intake. That's probably what I would add to that.
Yeah, that's great. It's definitely important not to forget about fiber. And we have a final special tip. You can use FODZYME when you go out. All right, so quickly, what is FODZYME? FODZYME is a blend of specialized enzymes that target the FODMAP groups, galacto-oligosaccharides, lactose, and fructan. It's a powder to sprinkle directly on your meal like a seasoning. And when eaten with your meal, it breaks down those specific FODMAP family's molecules, effectively reducing their burden in your GI tract. And using FODZYME can open up options on the full menu, particularly because it works on fructan, which is that pesky FODMAP family found in garlic, onion, and wheat, the most ubiquitous ingredient on a resin. Be mindful of polyols if you are sensitive to polyols. That's the P of FODMAPs. Our research and development team is still working on the solution. Bear with us. It's not trivial to create a completely novel enzyme and scale it up, but we're working on that. So in the meantime, be mindful of the ingredients associated with polyols while using FODZYME. Here is next is just a glimpse of some of the foods that FODZYME works on. Of course, this is a resource that will come with our products, but just a little sneak peek. And those ingredients together can turn into full dishes from diverse culinary traditions like these that you can enjoy with FODZYME.
Yum.
All right, we can move on to a few tips on using FODZYME when you're out and about. First, of course, it's important to know what dishes to use FODZYME on. So our tips from earlier about communicating with restaurant staff ahead of time and during the ordering process still do apply. As mentioned, we designed FODZYME as a powder specifically so that it can distribute best in the food. And that's critical for efficacy because the enzymes have to get to the places that get to the stuff that they're supposed to break down. And so 2 ways we recommend using FODZYME. One is you can sprinkle it all over your meal and mix it with the food if you can. If not, for instance, if you're eating more solid foods or things on the go, chew the full dose with your first bite and chew it well so that the enzymes are embedded in the food stuff that can distribute well in your gut. Dosage. Third tip is on dosage. Dosage is a balancing act, just like the low FODMAP diet. We made the FODZYME on-the-go stick packs with extra strength compared to our classic home kit, which is more designed for at-home use. And if you're extra sensitive, you may have to play with your dosage a little bit. And of course, if you're having a very large meal or having a long meal that extends over 30 minutes, we recommend dosing up and adding a second dose. And then finally, I love carrying a few in my pockets, bag and wallet, so that I always have them on hand, even for sometimes those impromptu meals out. Sometimes you just head out and didn't realize that you were going to end up having a meal or get takeout. And next we'll go on we'll offer a few bonus tips on using FODZYME specifically for when you're traveling and at parties. All right, so when you're with people, sometimes you can be sharing foods, and unless your friends are also FODMAP sensitive and you're feeling generous, you can just sprinkle the stick pack or your powder on your portion so that you get the full dose to yourself. Again, on the distribution point, we recommend sprinkling it across several bites across your full meal if possible to ensure maximum integration. Again, the basis for that, the intuition really is that you want the enzymes to be able to get across the meal and homogenize as quickly as possible so that they can break down the FODMAPs throughout, because the enzymes can't work at a distance. And on that note, when you're at parties or having small bites like hors d'oeuvre, canapes, tapas, and just bouncing between those small bites, I like to just tap it over a little bit if it's a small snack or small plate, and then I can actually just fold it up and use it later, or set it by my plate for the next courses so that I can distribute that throughout my evening or my event. All right, what's next? Well, FODZYME can be a powerful tool to enlarge your options while dining out with FODMAP sensitivities. That said, it is a tool and you have to use it, and there's an art to using it. We've mentioned a number of considerations already here, like the 2 recommended ways to administer the product to your food, either sprinkling it directly and mixing it in, or if you can't do that, add it to the first bite and chew well. One thing we didn't mention earlier is that the enzymes are sensitive to high heat, so we don't recommend using this while cooking. But when you're at a restaurant or catering event or just out, that should be totally fine because most of the food will be ready to eat by then. So a good rule of thumb to remember is that if it's cooled down enough to a temperature that you're comfortable eating, then FODZYME is safe to use. Awesome. Well, here is the moment that we've all been waiting for. We're going to do a live randomized giveaway of the attendees here. So thanks for sticking with us to the end. We'll also take some time for questions later. So Janie, Lisa, shall we do a drum roll?
Yes.
Congratulations, Sandra Burns. Getting a box of FODZYME goodies with a value over $100.
Congratulations, Sandra.
We'll be in.
Something I'd like to add as well, I don't know if you agree with this, Angie, but from my own use, I think it's really great as well to add it to your own dipping sauce. So if you have like a little sauce on the side, you're eating that throughout your meal. So it's also something that's good if you are sharing with somebody. So I don't know, if it's fries or something like that, then you have your own sauce, you can add the FODZYME to that, and then you're eating it throughout, and you also don't have to share it with anyone else. That's just something I've used, which has been really great.
Yes, that's actually a great tip that I like to share as well, because you are eating it throughout the meal and getting it distributed. I should add that, if it's also no problem if someone who's not FODMAP sensitive takes FODZYME or gets it in their meal. There's not going to be any adverse reactions because of that. And after all, we are all FODMAP sensitive to some threshold. It just happens that folks with gut issues like irritable bowel syndrome are more sensitive than others and have maybe a lower tolerance threshold in general. Again, congrats, Sandra. And should we move on to some questions for the next 10 or so minutes, and then we'll wrap up for the webinar.
Perfect. Shall I just run through some of the comments and we can all answer them if that works with you guys?
Sure. I'm also looking in the Q&A tab, so I can also start answering from maybe the order they were asked. I'll start with Sandy's question. Can I add FODZYME to my hot tea or chocolate tea? And this is a good question because I've just mentioned that FODZYME is heat sensitive, typically around 140 degrees Fahrenheit or 60 degrees Celsius is that's too hot for FODZYME. But once this is at your hot tea or hot chocolate is at a cool enough temperature for you to drink, which might be an individual threshold, then you can add it. I like my tea super hot, so that sounds like that might not be a good idea. But one thing to note about the liquid is that you can actually kind of pre-treat FODZYME because, or you can pre-treat it with FODZYME by adding a dose to the drink, say it's a smoothie or hot chocolate, and let it sit for a few minutes. So all of that FODMAP degradation is already done, and let it sit for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And that should be pretty good, unless you're having just a crazy amount of FODMAPs in there. That should be sufficient. And then you can reheat it because FODZYME has already done what it needs to do. If you want to have your super hot piping drink. Yeah. All right. Lisa or Shani, do you want to take this one more on the kind of nutrition side and FODMAP general side?
Mm-hmm.
So, Mike asks, I can handle garlic and onions, but other fructan strong products like wheat, I have not noticed a problem. Is it just onions and garlic is much stronger in fructans?
Yes. In my experience, in I guess clients and patients that I dealt with in my previous professional training in nutrition, in clinical nutrition, there are some individuals who find that garlic and onion is tolerated more poorly than wheat-based products like breads, pastas, cereals, and all that sort of thing. And that's indeed because the fructan concentration tends to be a lot higher in onions and garlic. So there's a very, very small amount of onions or garlic may be able to be tolerated, if any at all, just because of the sheer concentration of fructan. It's such a small serving size of onion and garlic. Lisa, do you have anything to add to that, or in your experience?
No, I think that covers it. I guess from just my experience in general, knowing people that have similar issues, onion and garlic is probably the most common problem. I myself also don't have an issue with wheat, but it really just depends on your individual sensitivity and working out what works for you and what doesn't.
Awesome. I realized that I didn't scroll down all the way, so sorry for some folks. I skipped over you. I'll go back to the earliest. So Jamie asks, if you let it sit on food for too long, does it change the taste? So generally, no, because FODMAPs are, especially fructan galacto-oligosaccharides, they're a very small portion of the foods, but they can just wreak a lot of havoc even by being a very small fraction of your meal. So FODZYME does break them down into simple sugars that will add a little bit of sweetness, theoretically, but because the fructan and oligosaccharides like GOS is such a small portion, it can be, for instance, like 0.2% and still be problematic in a meal, and there really shouldn't be much of a difference. But of course, if you're having something like that's just artificially full of inulin or other fructans, you could create sugar that way.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. Sandra asks, is there a chance FODZYME can help the gut when taking antibiotics? Lisa, Shaney, you guys might have more insights on kind of antibiotics and the microbiome and the gut, but I would just, on the FODMAP side of the question, I would say that FODZYME specifically breaks down FODMAPs, and it's not intended to treat any conditions or help with specific conditions, but we think of it as a tool to be able to get the best of both worlds while you're eating, and be able to have a food that's high FODMAP if you're sensitive, and lower the FODMAP content in that meal. The way food FODMAPs interact with your gut while taking antibiotics, that might be something better discussed with your clinician. Whether, for example, a low FODMAP diet works for certain folks better or is better suited to other individuals, that's a kind of a different question, but FODZYME is really intended for folks who know that they're FODMAP sensitive and want to be able to eat those high FODMAP foods again. Lisa, Shaney, if you guys have any thoughts on just maybe low FODMAP and how.
Yeah, sure. I was just going to mention, because the enzymes within FODZYME are targeted specifically to degrade FODMAPs, because they're so specialized, the FODZYME enzymes, they're not actually able to chemically or physiologically interact with the antibiotics. They're very different molecules altogether. So unfortunately, yeah, there won't be any direct, I guess, clinical benefit of combining them, for example.
In terms of the role of antibiotics as well, their job is to obviously fight off an infection you have. So they basically go into your gut and destroy all the bacteria, good and bad. And it's basically the best way to get rid of your infection or your condition. So the reason that the doctor will often prescribe you with a probiotic as well on top of your antibiotic is to replenish those gut bacteria that you've lost, the good ones. So that's something you can definitely recommend trying if you are on antibiotics. But yeah, FODZYME isn't really related to that side of things.
And kind of a related question from David, what about folks with SIBO? I imagine you're asking if FODZYME is intended or would work for folks with SIBO. Again, FODZYME isn't directed to folks with certain conditions. For instance, some people with SIBO might be sensitive to FODMAPs, or they might not, or there might be some other kind of relationship with diet. And we wouldn't recommend FODZYME for SIBO. But if you have SIBO and know that you have FODMAP intolerance to fructan, galacto-oligosaccharides, and lactose, FODZYME could be a good tool for you to be able to reintroduce those foods and also have a more diverse diet. But Shani, Lisa, if you want to jump in on anything on the SIBO front and what you've seen from customers and patients. Shani, you're muted.
Thanks for reminding me. We had a delivery come. Yes, there is a little bit of clinical evidence to show that a low FODMAP diet may be effective in reducing symptoms related to SIBO. So in SIBO, you've got an abnormal concentration of gut bacteria from the large intestine moving up into the small intestine, and those bacteria feed off FODMAPs, and it can cause similar IBS symptoms as what you would get in a normal IBS scenario. FODZYME obviously would help to degrade the FODMAP before the bacteria in the gut can attack FODMAPs within those foods that you're eating. So from that perspective, it may be helpful. But again, as Angie has mentioned, definitely ask your registered or accredited practicing dietitian to help lead you through the best way to use FODZYME for your specific scenario, because it may or may not help depending on what your clinical presentation is.
Yeah, I agree with what Shani said. Definitely.
All right, move on to a few more questions. Erica asks, how long is unopened FODZYME good? I bought some a while ago and forgot I had it. Now I like to start using it. Well, great, Erica. We're always here for you. If you have any questions getting started, you can reach us on Instagram, email, phone, text. We're here for you if you have any questions. I guess, well, depends on when you bought it, but there should be an expiration date on your container or sachets. So feel free to consult that. If you have any trouble, just feel free to contact us. But generally, the shelf life is pretty long, 1 or 2 years. So, so you're most likely fine. All right. I'll move on to Donna's question. Do you have any recommendations for someone who also takes pancreatic enzymes with meals, which include protease? I read in your materials that breaks down the 5-time, I'm guessing you mean FODZYME, and makes it less effective, or could it be potentially ineffective? So I'm interpreting the question as whether the pancreatic enzymes that you're taking that includes a protease in the formulation might interfere with FODZYME. Generally, I wouldn't worry about that. Your body is also making proteases, and your pancreatic supplement is a supplement to bring some more protease into your gut. And we've shown in vitro experiments based on a model of the human digestive system that in the stomach chamber, FODZYME is relatively stable in the presence of protease. So I wouldn't worry too much about using both. Definitely feel free to do so. All right, let's see. Jane asks, how is FODZYME different from lactate tablets, which never work for me? So FODZYME is different in 2 ways. Lactate only includes lactase to work on lactose, the disaccharide that's in milk products. But FODZYME also includes alpha-galactosidase to target the galacto-oligosaccharides, and fructan hydrolase, our novel enzyme, to target fructans. And the second difference is that FODZYME is a powder. We've seen that we've learned that this is the most effective way to administer enzymes because it homogenizes quickly with the food and doesn't have to wait for example, the tablets to disintegrate and then mix in your stomach. So those are two big differences. And of course, depends on kind of what your sensitivities are. If you've been using lactate tablets specifically for milk products, you might want to try FODZYME and sprinkling that over your dairy meals. Now we're coming up close to time. We'll maybe we can plan to wrap up, but I know there's still some hanging questions, and we'll be sure to get back to you or get to you in a follow-up. All right. Thank you so much for joining me, Shani.
Thank you very much for having this. I've actually learned a lot from you personally, Angie, from Lisa as well, and in answering everybody's questions that have been managed to be answered so far, I've already learned quite a bit. So they're really, really, really great questions, and we look forward to continuing to work together to answer those. And you would like to view this recording after the webinar, or if anybody else you think would benefit from watching this, especially if they're about to try FODZYME or thinking of trying it and haven't yet had the opportunity to try it, it would be really great to share this webinar recording with them.
Yes, the more we can spread the word and get waiters to start caring about our sensitivities, the better for all of us.
It's all about making it socially acceptable and working together to make that possible.
And feel free to drop us a line to FODZYME, to FodShop about anything FODZYME, FODMAPs related.
100%. Thank you very much.